Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray, and today is Popcast 88, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 38. I want to say that I've thought about it overnight, and I think I've come up with a better name for the civic practice that I would like us to use to remind ourselves of nature's wisdom. I think sharing hope might be better than self and other. I like the name self and other because it is the key to nature's wisdom that we need to both um, connect our selves to our own depths. So there's the self part. And we need to connect ourselves to others. So there's the other part. And essentially, in the connecting ourselves to our own depths, we come across the sense of the sacred. I've spoken of as awe, and it gives us hope, the energy of hope to live life, and leads us towards each other. We want the encouragement of knowing that others also have the sacredness in them and are given hope by it. So, sharing the self and other is very much an expression of nature's wisdom that points us in a correct psychological direction. And I would very much like to bring our growing knowledge of human psychology. Well, growing implies that somehow it's pretty close to getting, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Our our increased knowledge of ourselves needs to be utilized in our lives with each other because our hate it puts us in such a jam. Our psychology gives us our growing knowledge, our increasing knowledge of our psychology, though it's pretty paltry compared to the great mysteries of us. But our growing knowledge of our psychology is an element I would like to introduce into our public lives because we need to use it to combat the hate. So the question is how best to do it, and using an explicitly psychological phrase like self and others maybe isn't as good a choice as using the phrase sharing hope. Um, in effect, it's one step closer to what we need to lessen hate. Um, the beginning step is delving into self, refreshing your sense of the sacred from which your energy of hope comes. The second step is sharing that hope with others. Um, but that second step is the key step where the that lessens hope, lessens hate. When we share hope, we lessen hate. It's just the way it works. Our psychology seems to be set up that if you allow yourself to be reminded of the hope you share with others, your hate is just going to lessen. Um, just I'm excited as always. I keep thinking and working on this stuff, and so today I'm suggesting that the civic practice that I'm encouraging us to begin um, to that would remind us of nature's wisdom should be called sharing hope instead of self and other. Um, okay, so now we're going to go back and we're going to start reading some more pieces from Hoffer um, because they show us how much psychological factors are involved in the Great Divide, in the hate that's a part of most mass movements, and certainly that the hate that is very strongly involved in the the divide between Democrats and Republicans on every issue in the sun that we are experiencing now. So we're going to go back and look at some quotes to, get some, more detailed information about how strongly it's true that there's psychological aspects to this. So, sort of a side point. On page 28, Hoffer, I'm referring to the book called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, written in 1951. On page 28, Hoffer makes a statement that was considered fact at the time, but has since been discovered as being a lot more subtle and complicated than he knew. And I'm mentioning this instance because many of the things that we thought we knew about ourselves and about our history and circumstances are regularly being discovered to be significantly different and in ways that need our attention. So it's a reminder that humility is always called for, stuff you're pretty sure you know that everybody kind of agrees is the case, may turn out not to be the case. So, especially in the whole idea of ourselves and our history, unlike scientific ideas about how far the moon is or how much thrust you need to give a rocket if you want to reach Mars. Most of the important things that we deal with in our daily lives are each other, and we and each other are hugely complicated. And our relatively settled ideas about those things, we need to be a little bit humble about, because settled ideas about ourselves and each other are regularly undone. So he said that the migration of the Hebrews from Egypt developed into a religious and nationalist movement. Now, as it happens, it was always thought that essentially the story, the biblical story about the Hebrews leaving Egypt described a moment in time when the whole group of them got up and left. But that's apparently increasing evidence from the scientists who deal with these things, anthropologists, social anthropologists, and a whole bunch of other, scientific disciplines. Archaeologists, they've looked at the physical evidence, and they're not finding that there was a sudden movement out of Egypt and into the lands along the Mediterranean coast, that at the time referred to as Canaan. That in fact it seems to have been that there were Hebrews in Egypt, and that they did leave, and but not all in a day, all in a moment. And when they arrived, it seemed that they largely mixed in with the indigenous population for quite a while before they became a dominant force. And that the particular stories about the destruction of great cities, those city ruins have been found. Many of the cities have layer after layer, one on top of the other over the vast centuries of their existence. I think Jericho goes back like 5,000 years. And so 3,000 years ago, at the time spoken of in the Bible as when the Jews arrived in Canaan and destroyed Jericho, there doesn't appear to have been a destruction of the city at that particular time in the way described. So it doesn't mean that the Bible is wrong. It means that the details that it uses to tell a story were simplifications to make a point, and the point is still that we tell ourselves based on what arises from within us, stories about the sacred. Um, and most of us feeling the sacred arise from within us, assume it's an external divinity and give it and personify it and give it a name and make up rules about what it wants from us. But the key part of the Bible is that there is this sense within us of something sacred, that the universe seems to have some kind of creative goodness at work, and that's part of us as well. And that part seems psychologically sound. I'm not speaking, as always, but it's worth repeating. I'm not saying whether or not there is an external reality that corresponds to the sacred in us, but I am saying that as a matter of psychological fact is a hard word to use, but our current understanding, remember the warning about humility, our current psychological understanding is there is a strong sense of the sacred in us. So for our psychology's sake, we live from the sacred and we get our energy of hope from it. So the point I'm making is all of us can make statements that later turn out need to be modified. And the second point I'm making is so that includes Hoffer. He's done that in this instance, and we treat him with respect. Because it was innocently felt that what he said was true at the time he wrote it. And third, that we gain over time and more complex and considered view of scriptures, and see them as enormous gifts from our ancestors, where they essentially created stories that talked about their sense of the sacred and tried to make sense of the world from that point of view. And their contributions are precious to us, and we treat them in that light. We're going to talk a bit more in coming days about this whole general subject of things in Genesis and biblical interpretation in general, but particularly in Genesis. So that's part of why I took this aside. So now, sadly, on page 29, part 2 of the book begins, and the part 2 is about the potential converts, people who might well be enlisted in a mass movement that includes hate as a key feature. And so his first group of potential converts is sadly called the role of the undesirables in human affairs. I'm sorry, that's a pretty harsh word to use, even 70 years ago. That's a pretty harsh word to use. And, the word is still being used in modern political parlance. and it's actually part of the Great Divide. And it's being used in a similar fashion, you know, uh, by people on both sides. Um, Literally, in the context that there's a whole lot of people that wouldn't vote for me come hell or high water, but the way those people are described or thought of, is pretty harsh. And so, what are we to do? Should we throw out the book because this guy has socially uh, divisive attitudes? No, my recommendation is take what you can from the book. He's a knowledgeable and astute observer. He's also a person of his times. Um, he's a true intellectual, and of course, will suffer somewhat from arrogance. But the tone of the book is really not dripping arrogance, and his personal history is not that he was an intellectual snob. Um, but, we have to deal with this fact. He spoke of, in general, the role of the undesirables, and he begins with, uh, you remember I just talked about intellectual arrogance. He begins with this quote on page 29. The superior individual, whether in politics, literature, science, commerce, or industry, plays a large role in shaping a nation. But so do individuals at the other extreme, the failures, misfits, outcasts, criminals, and all those who have lost their footing or never had one in the ranks of respectable humanity. Wow. 1951. So that was considered acceptable words to use in describing um, two large groups of people, superior individuals and the individuals at the other extreme. Whoa. Um, and he says the the battles of history don't, for the most part, involve the majority in the middle. Um, so, again, even this is, an illustration from somebody about intellectual arrogance, the idea that a person, could be superior has to do with his intellectual achievements, um, that he's not in the middle class. And, so that would include professors and men of literature and science, leaders of commerce and industry, politics, literature. Wow. Okay, so what are we to take from that? That my point about intellectual arrogance being part of the problem and being a very harmful part of the problem is a good point, well established. Um, but what about what he says that these people at the other extreme um, may well be converts to a mass movement? Well, we'll see a little bit more from that as time goes on. It's his phrase, the ranks of respectable humanity, that sticks in my craw. I certainly, reputation is real, um, and a well-deserved reputation for being a scoundrel would put you outside the ranks of respectable humanity. But you got to be very careful that you don't put him outside of the ranks of humanity. You still want to be in uh, um, a fruitful relation to this person, and you'd hope that he would, begin to act more in ways that make that more likely. Um, you can't forget his humanity just because at the moment um, he is um, behaving so badly that he's lost your respect. And don't let him lose your respect. Don't lose your respect of himself as a person, just of the way that person is acting at the moment. Um, it just really, struck me that, that those phrases and the very, throwaway nature of the phrases. It's just the way things were then. There was a lot clearer inheritance of class consciousness on the part of people who were intellectuals, and there may still be a good deal of that. Um, we'll talk, we've talked about that before, and we'll talk more about it again. Um, on page 30, he says, the reason the inferior elements of a nation can exert a marked influence on its course is that they are wholly without reverence towards the present. They see their lives and the present as spoiled beyond remedy, and they are ready to waste and wreck both. Hence their recklessness and their will to chaos and anarchy. They also crave to dissolve their spoiled, meaningless selves in some soul-stirring, spectacular communal undertaking, hence their proclivity for united action. Thus, they are among the early recruits of revolutions, mass migrations, religious, racial, and chauvinist movements, and they imprint their mark upon these upheavals and movements which shape a nation's character and history. He goes on to say, the discarded and rejected are often the raw material of a nation's future. The stone the builders reject becomes the cornerstone of a new world. A nation without dregs and malcontents is orderly, decent, peaceful, and pleasant, but perhaps without the seed of things to come. It was not the irony of history that the undesired in the countries of Europe should have crossed an ocean to build a new world on this continent. Only they could do it. So that's a complicated piece. Um, the dregs become the cornerstone. Um, Not everything he says can be, easily absorbed. Uh, but you see my point. As I've said, what we're looking for here is the things he can tell us about how our current divide, with its high quotient of anger and hate, uh, can be the result of psychological as much as financial issues among people. Um, and on page 32, he talks about the unemployed workmen. Again, he's listing people who are likely to become converts to such a cause. He said, the present day working man in the Western world feels unemployment as a degradation. He sees himself disinherited and injured by an unjust order of things and is willing to listen to those who call for a new deal. Well, interesting phrasing. I do feel that being out of a job and not being able to find another one is pretty frightening, and puts people, potentially in the situation he says that they may be much more open to movements that are angry than otherwise. Um, I have a lot more quotes to read, but I think I've done enough for today. Uh, I've got more general ideas to discuss as we go along with each piece of this. Um, and I'm always going to try to keep the focus on how much our psychological condition plays into the willingness to join in with others in hateful groups, and for what information it might give us about how important responding to this psychological lack of confidence is. Um, and okay, usually I like to leave on a high note. So let me just tell you, I began the day with a wonderful phone call from my almost 12-year-old great granddaughter, Olivia, Liv. And Liv told me that Aunt Emmy, one of my wonderful granddaughters, who's expecting a baby soon, in due date August 7th, has already started to dilate. And who knows, might be inducing the baby soon. And big news, hospital says only one person can come into the hospital with mom. Can't be both Nana and hubby. Got to be one or the other. So Liv says, and M chose Uncle Mike. And Nana's disappointed, but understands. So the small things to get a call from your great granddaughter. And then she brought her two little sisters to the phone to say, hey, hi, Pop. And where are you? And we haven't seen you in a long time. Stuff like that. So it's been a pretty good morning. And I do like the change from self and other to sharing hope. Okay, take care. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.